So this talk title is Breaking Up the Boulders, DevOps and Legacy Regulated Industry. So I'm a site reliability engineer. My name is Eric Shamow. I'm a site reliability engineer for Blue Owl, which is not legacy regulated industry. It's just plain old regulated industry. And I'll talk about that change a little bit later. But why am I here? Why should you listen to me telling you this story? So I'll tell you a little bit about my own history. I started out as a regular operations engineer, doing operations for about 10 years at the time that this whole story starts. And I was pretty miserable. I thought that the decisions that were being made were pretty lousy, and I thought that I was working on a lot of stuff that didn't matter. And so I thought, like probably a lot of people in this room, well, if I just get to be a manager, it'll get better, right? It's the decisions, it's the quality of the decisions. So I went and became a manager, and it was like, wow, I got to care about people to do this job. This is actually more about people than technology. Clearly the problem is that I'm not a director. Directors only have a few direct reports, you see, right? It'll be much better. So I kept walking up the promotion chain, and what I realized as I'm doing this is that the decision-making is not really a function of the quality of the decisions, right? These are good people. They're trying to do their best. They're trying to understand what's going on. And so the reason that the decisions are poor is because the organizational focus isn't really aligned with where it needs to be. So that was a pretty sad realization, right? That this direction that I was heading wasn't going to help me. And around this time, the requirements had gotten so heavy, and I was so unhappy doing all this management that I didn't really want to do, and trying to take care of people that I wasn't very good at taking care of, and barely take care of myself. It was New Year's Eve. It was about 11:45 at night, and some senior VP called me up because he wanted to sync on things. And I said, what do we need to sync on? Did something happen? And he said, I don't know. I want to know if something happened. And I said, if something happened, someone should get fired. If it's me, it should be me. But like, I don't want to sync. And he insisted on syncing. I had to turn off my phone. And it turned out I had a bleeding ulcer. I discovered that night. And I was like, well, this really sucks. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just drive off into the sunset and not do this anymore, because then I'll be poor, but I won't have someone calling me at 11:45 on New Year's Eve. So I was doing this. I was doing what I thought of as DevOps at the time. This was about 2010, 2011. So dating this story a little bit, I was on IRC with some of the folks from Puppet sort of complaining about what was going on in my organization and saying, how do I work with people like you? I like you people. I want to work with people like you. How do I work with you? And they said, I don't know where we are. We're here. Come work with us. So I said, okay. So I got on the road and I came out to Puppet and spent about 5 years there. And while I was with Puppet, worked for the professional services organization, ultimately became methodologies lead. And my job as methodologies lead was to really understand what it was that makes configuration management tools stick. What is it that causes companies to be successful at doing these things to be different from companies that aren't? And I went around to a lot of companies and looked at them to try and understand what was going on. And I came to some core tenets, and I want to make clear the stuff that's on this next slide. These are my findings. These are not like official Puppet findings or anything. These are just the things that I came away with personally from looking at all of these companies. So some core tenets that I wrote down at the time. People over process over tools, not very creative, right? Straight out of the Agile Manifesto, but it matters a lot, right? Does my company take a look at the tool first, right? Or there's a company that comes in and says, I want to use this tool, and then tries to hammer it down on its people? Or does it first look at, who have I got? How are they working with each other, right? Then does it design processes around those things? And then based on those processes, does it pick tools to actually implement the things that it's trying to do? That order of decision-making matters a lot. Organizations that were successful make work visible, right? They simply don't have invisible work that's kind of assumed or taken on under the table or not talked about or not tracked. And I don't mean like heavy project management. I'm not saying 9 tickets and a change management request for everything that you do. It could be a sticky note on a wall, but somewhere the things that you do are visible and other people can see them and work with each other and prioritize around them. They valued honesty and transparency. This can sometimes look a lot like the make work visible thing, but it's a little bit different because I think this one's about intent, right? Do I trust that you are advocating to me for the organizational priorities as you best understand them? Are you transparent about what it is that's driving you? Do you come to me and tell me as another organization, hey, I can't do that, I have a competing initiative, or are you playing political games, right? That degree of honesty and transparency in work was really important. Security was included from the start, right? In a lot of organizations, security is an after-the-fact kind of thing. It comes along with a banhammer at the end when you've already slipped your schedules and says, nope, you're going to slip further, right? And organizations that were successful had security on the team, right? They were part of building a secure product. It was something that you built in. And so security was part of and an advocate for the process and the building of what it is that they were trying to build. These organizations automate everything that made sense to automate. I include that just because I started with automate everything, and then I found some companies really go crazy automating everything and they lose the plot. So I've amended this to say it automates what makes sense to automate and gets in front of people what makes sense to have in front of people, right? Dashboards matter. One team, one goal, right? And what I mean by this is some organizations, many organizations, a team is a collection of individuals reporting to a manager. Right? And each one of them is like a little autonomous unit moving off in its own direction, doing its own things. The organizations that are successful that I saw had one team that were working on an understood shared goal. They helped each other. They traded tasks, right? When things weren't working out, sometimes someone took on more work, sometimes someone took on less, and nobody was really comparing about like who's doing more because everybody trusted each other to work together because they were all trying to get to the same place, and they were all incentivized for doing the same things. And the last thing that I discovered was really that lean principles will guide you. And what I mean by that is flexibility is important in this process, right? We can buy into all the individual processes we want. We can do Scrum. We can pick sprint cadences, right? We can structure stories a certain way. All of that matters to a degree. But what matters more is, am I thinking about single piece flow? Am I thinking about my cycle time? Am I learning from every cycle that I engage in? Am I adapting my process to meet the things that are actually happening on the ground? The best organizations that I knew were agile about their agile. Right? They weren't stuck on particular principles, but rather open to learning from reality. So I became a consultant and shopped these principles around to a bunch of companies and stuck them in front of managers and said, haha, deal with this. And they were like, no, we were looking for a consulting gig to come help us do some config management, right? And I was like, okay, all right. And my company was good enough to let me keep doing this. And I finally found a VP who put it to me this way. He said, my organization is full of giant boulders. And there's good, valuable stuff in those boulders, but I need help breaking them up. And I wish I could say that I trusted this guy right away, but I didn't. So I put him through the ringer. I definitely had a lot of very uncomfortable lunches where I pointed my finger at him and told him things that were wrong with his organization. And he kind of nodded and said, yeah, that sucks. And after a while, I realized this guy gets it. This guy gets that it's culture first. This guy gets that the organization itself is what has to change, not the processes, not the tools that we're using, not the things that we build, but the people need to change that they work. And so I said, okay. Now, you'll notice I said I'm not there anymore. This is not so much a failure as that guy left. And when he left, I examined myself and went, do I have the empathy to rebuild this relationship with a new exec and actually start doing this again, or is this about time for me to get off the road? And I got off the road. And I'll talk a little bit later about why and some advice that I would offer to past me to avoid that happening, and that I would offer to all of you, hopefully, that might help some of you avoid this for yourself. But I definitely burned out. But that's not to say that this effort was a failure. They're doing great, and they're going to keep going, right? And so this is really the state of things, the snapshot of where I was when I left. Here's what I learned. So this list of obstacles, I won't say that this, again, was not a thing that that VP signed off on or anything, but this is effectively the stuff that we were talking about in all those uncomfortable conversations that we came to understanding about. So what were our obstacles as an org? The people we've hired, right? And I don't mean that as a pejorative. It's not that they weren't quality people. These were actually really smart, engaged, caring people who cared about their jobs. But for a long time, they were hired to manage legacy infrastructure. And so their entire job revolved around stability, risk aversion, not making changes, saying no, right? These are not people who are fundamentally, it just doesn't give them juice to wake up in the morning and download a whole bunch of stuff off the internet and try it out and then get on a forum and argue about it. This is not who they are, right? And you're asking these people to make a fundamental change in the way that they present information, the way that they learn from each other, the way that they relate. It's a big deal. Individual focus. This was really interesting. The organization prided itself on being a customer service friendly organization, and they are. But their definition of customer service is being really nice and saying yes to anybody that walks up to you and asks for anything. So there was effectively this really well-reinforced form of organizational ADD where you could like derail any major corporate initiative by just walking up to someone and being sufficiently loud. And this really made it difficult for the organization to stay focused on getting things done. And since any one of those things, any one of those interrupts was a valid reason to have done that, that didn't even cause management to get upset. It was like, oh, you know, he said yes to the database update that wasn't supposed to be done for 3 months. That was nice of him. Yeah. Another individual value issue was over-planning. And I'll talk a little bit about our working environment, but because it was so difficult to get anything installed, engineers' first process was, you know, when presented with, hey, we need to solve this problem, was to open a Word doc, right? They'd open a Word doc and start writing about what it was that they needed to do, start writing a justification for what it was that they needed to install or build. Then they would call up probably their primary software vendor, right, and say, what do you have that solves that problem? And they'd get a list of solutions. If they were one of the more diligent engineers, they would call up some colleagues and say, what are you using? And maybe get some alternatives and call those people up. And you know, within 2 or 3 months, there'd be an engineer on site to do a proof of concept or maybe a sales pitch. There'd be some conference calls in the meantime, right? Someone would come on site, do a sales pitch, and you know, hey, within 3, 4, 5 months, you might actually have a proof of concept running where you could see what this thing does. It's excellent turnaround time. For me, if somebody says they have a problem and I haven't been on like Hacker News and then clone 3 GitHub repos within 15 minutes, I feel anxious that I haven't done my job, right? And this was understandably a culture clash, right, between 2 different types of people. Team focus. This was one of those organizations with teams that was just, you know, individual autonomous units, right, reporting to a manager. And so they simply didn't know what it was like to work as a team or to collaborate on a solution, and it didn't make them comfortable. It made them more comfortable to have individual achievement, and they believed they were going to be incentivized based on individual achievement, and that they'd lose credit if someone else got credit for their work. That's a tough thing to overcome when somebody's been paid like that for 20 years. Product ownership. So how many people in here are familiar with the notion of project versus product ownership? A good number, but I'm going to define it anyway because enough don't. So effectively, the idea with project management is that we have a project to do, right? We need to upgrade the databases, right? So we're going to assign a project manager. We're going to assign a group of engineers to do that project. We are going to ram through the upgrade to all the databases, right? And then when we're done, the team will disband, and we're done, right? All those learnings are effectively lost, right? They don't go anywhere, and the team is gone. With a product model, right, you essentially have a thing that you are maintaining with a backlog associated with it. And you say, these are the databases. And there may be a project that is going to come run across the database servers, right? But each one of those product owners is going to say, OK, this has resulted in the following technical debt, which we now need to address. Or this is going to conflict with this other project. So here's what we need to do to make the both of them play well together. It's not that this organization didn't understand that they needed to do that. It's that they didn't have the skills to do it. Right? Product ownership is a discipline. It's hard. I've tried to play product owner in the past. I'm really bad at it because I'm not formally trained, so I know how hard it is. There's a whole methodology, even if you understand the values of it, right? The methodologies around how do you build a backlog? How do you run a stakeholders meeting, right? How do you say no to so many people and keep them convinced that you're on their side and that you're building the things that matter to them? How do you do research? All of these are really hard questions that professionals work very hard to solve. You know, getting that into an organization in a short period of time, not easy. We talked a little bit about technological choices, so I won't beat that one to death, but there is the additional issue that when you tend to look at closed source solutions or to vendors for solutions, you're not looking at open source, right? You're generally not going and cloning down a bunch of repositories. You are calling up EMC and asking, is there another module that does what I want to do? Working environment was really interesting. They cared a lot about keeping employees comfortable. So I had like this really nice ergonomically designed chair and desk that they came and measured me for and like made sure it was like correct and that my arm angles were correct, you know, to keep OSHA compliant. But yeah, I couldn't get anything installed on my laptop, right? I had a Windows 7 laptop with a spinning hard drive and 4 gigs of RAM. And there was, you couldn't run virtualization software on it, right? Like you couldn't do anything. And you know, effectively every employee in the organization had the same laptop, and when you talk to the desktop team about it, they'd say, deal with it. Everybody else deals with it. Right? So the importance of engineers being comfortable, of being able to actually do their work, or of this being a tool that, you know, we're not trying to get games installed. I'm not asking for Solitaire, right? I'm asking for Vagrant. So, you know, the ability to get important stuff running was kind of below the keeping the process running. And lastly, regulation and the role of security, right? That in this organization, even though the VP of security understood kind of the role that security needed to play in the future, much like the infrastructure team, he had hired for stability, right? And so he had a bunch of checklist followers, and these checklist followers were not familiar with a lot of the tools and processes that we wanted. And I'll talk a little bit about how we worked around that. So what did we do? One of the reasons that I came to this company was the massive amount of resources that they poured into helping their people. I couldn't believe it. I've worked at a bunch of startups and Silicon Valley companies, and I've never seen an organization put this much effort into like helping a small group of people not get hit so hard by the 21st century, right? So we did classes on Git, we did classes on Puppet, we did classes on Agile. And when I say classes, I mean we actually wrote those classes, we brought in consultants, we taught them to small groups, like 5 or 6 people with exercises, with follow-ups. We did theoretical intros to version control and CI/CD. We did see one, do one, teach one lessons, where we essentially tried to help these people go out and teach this to other people in the org. So we said, hey, if you come watch us do a thing, we'll then sit with you and do a thing. We'll then watch while you sit with someone else, and then you are blessed to go off and teach that thing to other people. So the idea was to set up some kind of self-replicating environment. We worked on exercises and practical experience pairing and working as a team. They just had a hard time working together. They weren't used to it. Right? And so we did a bunch of stuff that wasn't actually that important, just trying to get people used to collaborative teamwork, right? And getting reinforced for working together. We brought in some Agile consultants to do product ownership lessons and to do story writing and decomposition sessions, because for a while we would get really low fidelity stories, right? Or stories that said, I want this particular driver installed in this particular place. And it's like, well, why? What are you trying to do? What's the background of this? As a blah, what, right? You know, worked with some Agile coaches to really get better story writing coming out of individual engineers. And we moved to a sprint cadence for development, which would have posed a problem as we operationalized later on. But for the phase that we were at, trying to get a predictable velocity, trying to build some confidence that a team could actually do things this way, the sprint cadence was really helpful. So at our peak, we had 4 engineers working against a single backlog on a single product. We had a shared infrastructure code base that we worked out of. We'd built a tool called IA. I built a terrible, terrible part of it, so I'll take credit for how bad that was. But it was a tool that bootstrapped automation against vCenter that kind of gave us an in to the environment. We used server spec and actually then inspec to validate configurations. That was actually one of the biggest wins that we had from a technological perspective. Inspec, or server spec at the time, took off like lightning around the org. My initial reason for using it was simply to say, look, you don't trust automation, fine. You write the test suite. Right? I will build the server, you build the server, we'll run them both against the test suite. If the test suite passes in both cases, if my automation still isn't good, you need to fix your test suite, right? I'll make your tests pass. That turned out to be unbelievably effective. They loved that challenge. And we ended up, even with security, writing their specs in server spec, which really helped later on because it was easy to understand what they were trying to do. We used Puppet and then Ansible for configuration management. I'll talk about that shift in a little bit. Always used Ansible for orchestration. And we had bi-weekly ceremonies, a product roadmap, and an advisory committee. So we got really far. And this organization really was committed to making this happen. So then I met the resistance. And the thing about resistance is, when I came there, I viewed it as an obstacle. But resistance isn't always bad. Resistance teaches you about reality. Right? Because I'm coming in here with these kind of highfalutin principles and these great ideas. These are people who are living on the ground in this organization with the reality of what it is that it needs to produce, right? And so the resistance can be frustrating, but the resistance also teaches you what it is that's really happening on the ground, and it forms your effort into something that's real. In this case, here are some things that I learned from dealing with the resistance. Understand what's important, right? Understand that your values are not necessarily the company's values, and that's not always a bad thing. There are times when it is. There are times when your values being at odds with the company's values means something serious. It means you need to leave, or the company's on the wrong track, or you're on the wrong track, right? But sometimes they're just different. Sometimes they're the values that you picked, right? And the company's values are just different, and that's fine. And what's more, the values during the transformation may very much be different than the values at the end of the transformation. So I'll give you a practical for instance on this. I came into that organization pushing Puppet. I was a Puppet employee. I knew Puppet. I certainly wasn't going to rock the boat and go with something I didn't know very well to start a very complicated transformation. And when I worked with Puppet, there were 2 properties of Puppet that we pushed a lot to people. They were idempotence and really the declarative model. How many people in here know what idempotence is? Nice. So for those that don't, effectively, idempotence is an operation that you can perform one or multiple times on a server or anything and get the same result. Kind of the great example is the bat signal, right? When you turn on the bat signal once, you get Batman. If you flash the bat signal multiple times, you don't get like multiple Batmen, right? The same Batman has shown up, right? That's idempotence. I care a lot about that, and I care a lot about understanding what your servers are supposed to look like. I spent a lot of time walking into organizations where they said, well, we've got these scripts, and I'd say, well, what's the end state? And they go, well, I don't know. The script does stuff, and then it's done. And I spent a lot of time saying, well, I care about what it's supposed to look like so that I can keep it remediated to that state, right? And that mattered a lot to me. What I discovered in this organization was that because of the bias toward planning, velocity was a lot more important than understanding that stuff. Understanding that stuff was important, and it could have come later, right? But at the phase that we were at, actually just getting your hands on a keyboard and building something to see if it was the right thing to build, getting something automated and adding in idempotence later, is it ideal from a technological perspective? No. Was it the right thing to actually get them producing something inside of a sprint so they could show some velocity and build on it? Yeah. So do I love the code base that we built? No. Are they going to have to refactor it another 12 months? Oh, yeah. Right? But I refactor my configuration management code base every 12 to 18 months anyway, right? From all the stuff that I realized I didn't do right. So the reality is, did it slow them down? I think it sped them up. Their values were different than mine. On the regulation front, I'm not going to hammer in the whole regulation ITIL thing. How many people in here are familiar with ITIL? Yeah, a lot of hands go up for ITIL, right? Not going to talk too much about that other than to say standard changes are your friend. A standard change is essentially a change in most organizations that you've made effectively 3 times and have walked through the process comfortably. And then all of a sudden there's a lot less paperwork involved because the org can bless this as a standard change. That made my life a lot easier. But the thing that was more important than the technical details of how I worked through change management was focusing on the what and why and not the how. Right? We had a lot of process-focused people in change control, a lot of process-focused people in security who were worried about, have you passed this checklist? And really, it was getting them on the team that made a difference. It was having them part of the sprints. It was having them approve code requests, right? Git pulls that involved security stuff. It was making sure that their security suite was part of the post build in my Packer builds, right? So that every Packer, every AMI that came out, every image that came out was security compliant, right? And at the end of the day, when it came time to actually release this stuff into the wild, it was the security person on my team who intervened with security to say, no, they're compliant, and here's the track to get them into compliance, so don't worry about the fact that it doesn't pass the checklist. They meet all the specs that we need to meet. I needed that security person to do it. They wouldn't have trusted it coming from me. It needed to authentically come from them, and it was a model for how they could participate going forward. Don't try to automate your legacy infrastructure and greenfield at the same time. You will piss everybody off and you will not make friends. I offer that with a caveat. If there is a clear roadmap from one to the other, if you are actually like migrating legacy into greenfield and you're saying like, okay, here's the schedule for decommissioning and we're gonna, yeah, sure, automate it in one place, do your lift and shift, right, or whatever it is that you're gonna call that. That's fine. That's one thing. The thing that's important to remember is that your legacy people have a day job and their day job is horrible. It's horrible, right? It's why I got into this, was to escape it. My house was on fire, and I'm trying to put out my house all the time, right? That's what these people are doing. It is insanely cruel to put those people in a room at one hand and say, oh, the outcome of this doesn't matter, don't worry about it, only complete your sprint commitments, say no to anything that isn't on your plate, and then put them in another room where any project manager can order them to take on any technological task to rescue anything at any time of the day or night. It is not possible for somebody to operate in those two states for a very long period of time, let alone like 6 months or a year or 18 months, without getting them confused. It's not kind. And ultimately, what it ended up leading to was a lot of conflict between teams that should have been aligned on their goals. Right? Legacy has an important thing to do. If there's a mainframe that's got to keep running because your org runs off of a mainframe, and that mainframe's not going to be retired for 24 months, don't poke the mainframe person. Don't. Work with them, right? Build a service around them. Build a wrapper service so that you can interact with the wrapper service and then talk to them about what they need to get the wrapper service working. Do what you need to do, but don't mess with those people purely for the sake of getting them on board with your principles. They can't live by your principles. Those are the things that worked. Here are the things that didn't. The number one thing I would say is letting personalities run the show, including mine. What I realized about that effort some ways into it is that what they were hoping I would do is come in and be the DevOps guy, right? And that I would push the culture thing, and that my force of personality would help drive my team to do that. And that was the way that they ran teams across the company, right? And what that leads to is a bunch of people with strong personalities butting heads with each other when their individual efforts run into each other. Right? And then that just ends up being conflict between strong personalities. That's not organizational discipline, right? So definitely, like, bringing someone in and hoping that their personality is going to drive the team isn't going to work. You have to get your managers to understand what the behaviors that you want to incentivize is and push that change from the middle management up and down. But the number two thing that I discovered, and the thing that surprised me the most, was engineers not working on engineering tasks. If I worked a 40-hour week at that company, I am shocked if I spent 10 hours actually working on real engineering. And of that 10 hours, I would spend maybe 2 to 3 in some kind of flow state, and only that if I was able to block myself out of conference room and shut off all my alerts and actually work for a while. The amount of time that I actually was able to spend on sprint commitments was shockingly limited. And the rest of it was mostly spent like in meetings, on conference calls with people who didn't even know if I needed to be there or if they needed to be there, moving calendar invites around, fighting with the calendaring system, going to mandatory trainings. I mean, the amount of time that I spent doing things that weren't engineering was shocking. And you know, I think some of this just comes down to like, you can make one person on your team responsible for those things if they have to get done, right? Like nominate a person each sprint that's like the calendar wrangler and let that engineer do all the calendar wrangling, fine. But keep most of your engineers focused on doing most of the work most of the time. They're paid highly to do this and they're not good at the other things, right? So I mean, to a certain degree, you have to be a grown up and go to meetings, and then to another degree, it's like don't invite people to meetings they shouldn't be at. It's a waste of everybody's time. Business decisions being made based on personal relationships. I don't actually mean this to mean the same as the force of personality thing. I mean this to mean the fact that when my laptop needed Vagrant installed, I was able to walk up to the desktop people and elbow them and say, hey, I need Vagrant, and they installed it. You know, essentially, like, being able to force those things through on a personal level doesn't actually help you get anything going. Putting legacy and greenfield at odds, right? Keeping both, we talked about that a little bit, and I'm speeding up a little bit just because I'm reaching the end of my time, but essentially recreating that core chronic conflict dynamic, right? It doesn't matter if it's dev versus ops. If you put dev and ops on the same team, if it's dev and ops versus QA, if it's DevOps and QA versus security, if it's all of those versus the business, you're still missing the plot, right? So, and all of this really came down to lack of defined roles, right? Lack of a clarity as an engineer about what I'm supposed to do. If something comes into me, should I say yes to it? Should I say no to it? My boss said to say no. My peers are saying I'm supposed to say yes. The project manager says I'm supposed to absorb it. It doesn't make sense, and so I don't know what my boundaries are. For me, the signs that I was starting to burn out and losing empathy were really critical. So here are some signs you're losing the plot. Number one, you're working on your cathedral, right? You have your perfect little application that you go off and you work on all the time, and that's why you can't go to any meetings or do anything or work with anybody, right? Because you need to go work on your thing. It's really important, only you can work on it. Yeah, bad sign. You're probably not helping people if you're doing that. Empathy drain was another one. I found myself judging people and sort of, you know, really pre-assuming I'm not going to be able to work with this person, right? This is not going to work. That's a pretty bad sign. Similarly, I stopped pairing and I stopped teaching. Those weren't deliberate choices. Those were more, I just noticed them. It was like, wow, it's been 2 weeks since I paired with anybody, right? They're things that I did because I had energy, and then I didn't have energy, so I wasn't doing them. But they were indicators for me. Where's your ticket? Anybody that's worked in ops has definitely pulled that routine. That ain't DevOps, folks. Talk to people, help direct them to the right place to do what they're supposed to do. Information hiding was a big one, right? I don't want to include blah in the meeting. The meeting is 30 minutes. We need to talk about how to automate blah. This person's going to come into the meeting and say, I don't want to automate blah. I can't afford to have that person in the meeting. That's a bad place to be. You need to be able to bring that person along, right? If you can't do that, you're not helping. So ultimately, what is it about, right? It's all about interactions. It's all about how engineers interact with each other. And fundamentally, in each one of those interactions, they need to have three critical components: trust, autonomy, and responsibility. Do I trust you that what you're telling me is your truth, right? That you're sharing with me your reality? Do you have the autonomy to do the things that I trust you to do, right? So when you say you're going to do something, are you actually authorized to do that? And are you held responsible for doing it? And when I say held responsible, I don't mean does the organization hold you responsible, right? It's not a top-down management thing. It could be your peers, it could be me, it could be yourself. You might have your own accountability process where you come back to me and say, hey, I didn't get done all the things I committed last week. Here's what I'm going to do about it. That's responsibility. All I'm saying is, if I talk to you and you talk to me, can we trust each other? Do we both have the authority to do the things that we're committing to? And are we both going to have some kind of process that kicks in if we don't? So if you're a manager or if you're working for someone, here are some good questions to ask. Are your engineers working on the tasks they're best at? Are they focused on the things they need to be focused on? Are managers keeping your engineers focused on a team goal? Is there a team goal, right? Or are there 8 team goals? Because guess what? If there are 8 team goals, there are no team goals. Is there one? When conflict arises, how is it handled? Conflict is not bad. Conflict is not a negative thing. Conflict is just, conflicting needs arising, right? But how you handle it can be very good or bad. So is conflict being handled in a way that's healthy and helps the organization grow? Or is it being handled in a way that causes personalities to degrade friendship, trust, relationships between people? Ultimately, what is the quality of interactions in your organization? Thank you.